In this video, we're going to add a dash ability to our side-scrolling character. So if we come over here, we press a button and dash just like that. And basically we want to be able to move around our level. You can see it'll go mostly horizontal. Sometimes it'll go slightly diagonal. You can have more complexity later, but we'll look at how to implement this and trigger some basic audio and particle effects with it. And I should also say that you can technically put this dash on other character controllers too. I'm just putting this on my side-scrolling character because I need it for this particular kind of game, but we're just dashing in the forward direction. So this should work for any other project that you're using a character for. All right, let's start creating our dash. So we have our character over here. If we hit play, we can move around, but nothing happens when we hit whatever button we want the dash to be on. So I'm going to escape. I need to define a button and my input actions to handle the dash. Now, every game type is going to handle this differently. Let's go to project settings, scroll down to input, and we need to define an action map for our dash and then assign a button to it. So to do that, just hit the plus button and we'll say dash. And then we need to define a keyboard input for our dash as well. Now, if you want this to work in a controller later, you can totally add that in addition to a keyboard input, but for testing, I'm going to do keyboard. I think shift will work pretty well. Maybe left shift is fine. Okay, so when we press left shift, our dash action will get called in Blueprints and we can hook into that and do whatever we need. So once we have that set up, we can close out, come back in, and now we're going to add our dash ability to our character. Now, there's also lots of ways to do this, but to keep things simple, I'm going to add it directly onto my character since this is the character that I want to have the dash ability. So I'm going to open up my blueprint SS character, or in your case, whatever character you're using for your character blueprint or your actor blueprint or whatever. I think for this to work the way that I set it up, you actually do need it to be a character component since I'm messing with the gravity. So just make sure that it has a, over here, our character movement component on it, and you should be fine if this is the thing that your player is controlling. All right, so then how do we do this? Again, to keep things real simple, we're going to put it just directly in here in the event graph on our character. First thing is let's right click and let's hook into the dashing input action or whatever you called it. For me, I think I called it dash. We'll move that down. And when we press the dash action input that it's looking for, which in our case was left shift, when we press it, we want to do something. So if we pull off and we type maybe just a print string dash, we can use this just for testing purposes. And what I want to do right now is I just want to set up the basic structure of our dash. I want to press shift dash for a certain amount of time, then disable the dash, and then wait some amount of time if I want my dash to have a cooldown. So I think some things that I'm going to need, I'm going to start creating variables for. So for example, we're going to come over here into our variables. Again, yours might look slightly different than mine. That's totally fine and expected. Click the little plus button on variable. And then over here, the first thing we're going to want is a variable for is dash ready. And we can, calculate this with our cooldown and whatever. So we'll set this whenever we don't want the dash to be able to be re-triggered. So we don't want to dash while we're already dashing. And we don't want to dash while our dash is on cooldown. So we'll just leave a little, like a little lockout boolean for ourselves. Is dash ready? There are other things that we could use this variable for as well in gameplay. It's just kind of handy to have a little lockout for if we don't want the dash to happen. Potentially, we could also just call this can dash, but I'll keep it is dash ready. The type of boolean, because we want it to be true or false, that is actually fine. What else do we want? For category, let's make a new category on our character to hold all of the dashing variables because we're going to have a couple. So let's make a new category. If we click the drop down, we can see the already existing ones, but I want to put this in a new one and we'll call this dashing. And you see if I put that there over here, it creates a new little drop down for us on our variable list and we can see all of these here. I don't need it to be public. I'll handle that all through Blueprints, so we're fine there. So let's drag that in just to get a reference to it. We'll do get, so we can test is dash ready. Okay, so first off, we can say when we press the button, if is dash ready, then continue. So I'm going to do a branch node here, same as a if statement in coding. Branch, so I'll branch off. So we'll say pressed branch, if dash is ready, then dash. Okay. All right, so we'll just move that out a little bit. I like to kind of stack my inputs underneath my nodes. Okay, if dash is ready, then dash. Meaning what I want to do by default is make sure that is dash ready starts off as true. Now we could also set this and begin play if we really want to make sure, but again, I'm going to try to keep this simple. So we don't have a default value yet because we have not yet compiled. And you can see the little question mark up here. So we will compile and save. And so now we can set a default value for our is dash ready. Let's default it to true. So start off dash is ready, and we should be able to call it in. So once we dash, then we want to set it as false. So we'll say set is dash ready. So set is dash ready. Okay. So all this is doing is we are setting this variable, this is dash ready, to now be false. We want to turn it off because we've started our dash at this point. Actually, we can hook this in after if we like. Maybe that would make more sense. So true, print the statement. We're now beginning our dash. So we'll set that and we'll set it to false. The only reason I'm pulling my print string up above this is just so I can make it clear that I can delete that and reconnect this later. So it's just for visibility, really. We're going to handle some logic here. But once that logic is over, we want to wait a certain amount of time, like dash duration. So I think we probably want to make a dash duration variable as well. So let's go ahead and make that. So we're going to wait for a certain amount of time while we're dashing and then disable the dash. So I'm going to make a new variable over here. We'll hit the plus button. And because this is a amount of time and a duration, that's going to be a type of float because we want to count point seconds or whatever. So we'll call this dash duration. And variable type, we just said that that's a type of float since it's going to have a decimal value. I think we do want this to be instance editable. We want the designer to be able to change that. And that'll give us a little eyeball over here. And also, let's put this into the category with our dashing as well. Just like that. So you see that we have a drop down now since we predefined it. It's already there and we can slot it in so we can expand it if we like. All right, dashing, and we want a default value, right? So through experimentation and just kind of like a starting point, let's set this to 0.2 because we want this dash to be really quick, right? Dash, move really quick and then stop. So I think 0.2 is a good default value. And then designers can change it if they want it a little longer or shorter. So in order to get that default value, remember you have to compile and then save. Then you can say dash duration 0.2. Again, we'll just compile save to store that. Because we have our dash duration, we can pull off and say we want to wait for the dash duration. Again, we'll replace that logic later. Wait for the dash duration, so delay. Sometimes you may see people use a timer, set timer by event or function name or whatever. The main difference here is a timer just kind of like starts a timer and then continues in your execution. A delay will actually pause here and then only continue once it's complete. We're going to do a delay so that we can pull off of here and then undo all of our dash things. Like we'll reset our variables and rechange our gravity and all that. So if you decide to do a timer, timers are super powerful. You can start a timer and then hook into when the timer is complete somewhere else, but it is different in how your nodes execute. And that's actually very important. So we're going to delay. And then once we're done, let's pull off another print string. We'll say print string and we'll call this stop dash. Okay. So dash and stop dash. Maybe we'll actually relabel this start dash. All right. And theoretically, once we get these triggering where we want, then we could turn those into functions and, replace that there. So let's pull off of the execution. Once we stop the dash, then we can set our is dash ready to be true. So make sure you check that little box there to set it to true. All right, so what this will mean is that we should not be able to dash while we're already dashing because when we press the button, we start the dash and we turn it to false. And so if we try to re-enter this, if we press the button again, it will only allow us to continue if we're true, right? And we're only turning it back to true once we've waited the dash duration and then reset it to true. Let's compile save and see how that works. So compile save, come back in here, hit play, and we put it on shift. Maybe yours is different, but mine's on shift. Okay, you can see how quick that is, but if I press it twice in succession, you see how it didn't re-trigger? It did start stop. And you can test that all you want, but I'm reasonably sure that it works, but if it doesn't as we continue to build out, then that's fine too. So this is kind of the basic structure for getting our ability activating where we want. I kind of like to set up the basic skeleton, like, when is it triggering, when is it stopping? And then we can add the logic after that. And we'll continue to build that now that we have the basics working. One thing that I realized that I forgot is I put my duration right here as a number, but we actually want to pull from the variable that we created. Super easy to miss, but it's actually it's really important that we put this in here. So I'm going to drag and drop my dashing variable in here and say get dash duration, and whatever the designers define as the dash duration, then that's how long we'll wait, not whatever the coder defines as the dash duration. Super important. We'll compile, save, and fix that. So now we want to put in the actual logic for dashing. So start dash, what do you want to do? What makes sense to me is there's a node inside of Blueprints called launch character. And what this will allow us to do is we can actually shove the character in a certain direction. Typically you would use this for jump pads and things, but for a dash, we're just going to push them forward really quick. Now this is not perfect, right? This is why sometimes in our final result, we'll get slightly varying horizontal movement depending on the arc in our jump and, using gravity. For me, I actually don't care. In my game, I'm going to consider that a feature because I want it to be a little bit unpredictable. But if you want a more exact dash, like you want it to move in a perfect straight line, then you'll have to do some extra work to customize that. But I want to give you the basics of how we could do this. So we're going to look at the launch character blueprint node. And just to show you, I'm opening up the documentation over here with the launch character node. You can see more information about the parameters that it takes, but you can also find other things here. And this is one of the many things that we get by using the character blueprint, which is super useful. A lot of the basics are handled for us, which is why we would want to use it. So I just wanted to show you that. And you might even be able to find even more about the character component, other things that you can do for other feature abilities and ideas that you want. So I'm going to close that. And for our dash, let's put in the logic. Now, this is going to seem kind of weird, and I'm going to give myself some space here. Actually, I think I'm going to do this after the variables. We'll pull that out. So we want to do our dash, and then we want to wait, and then we want to undo and exit and, kind of clean ourselves up. What we want to do is we want to launch the character in their current forward direction, at least the way that my dash is working, because we could dash in a direction, but if we're facing the other direction, we actually want to make sure that we dash the reverse direction too, if they're facing that way. Now we could do this also based on what keys we're holding. And theoretically, if we have long rotation speeds where we're turning around and we hit the dash while we're turning, then we might actually end up dashing in place. Again, I'm keeping things real simple. I'm thinking that that's fine for my game. We could always make the rotation speed instant if we wanted to fix that. The other reason I'm doing it this way is because you could put this dash in a third-person game instead of a side-scrolling, and it would still work. It's just dashing in the forward direction. So I'm going to keep it simple. We can add complexities later. So I'm going to launch character in forward direction. And that's going to be a little bit weird in terms of the blueprints nodes, but know that that's what we're working towards. First off, we want our launch character node. So let's right click and type in launch character. And the reason we have access to this, click on it. The reason that we have access to it is because our blueprint that we're working off of is a type of character blueprint. And if you remember, character inherits from pawn, which pawn is a thing that a player can control, and pawn inherits from actor. And there might be other tiers there, I honestly can't remember, but that's kind of generally the layers that we're moving up. So character is like a very complex type of pawn, and that gives us access to things like launch character. So anyways, because our particular pawn is a type of character, which we created early on, then we can launch the character. Right, so I'm going to plug that in right there. And the target is a self. Right here, you see self, because this blueprint is a type of character. So it allows us to do that. Target is character. All right, we'll bring that closer. And now we want to determine the launch velocity. So this is essentially the direction that we want to launch the character in. We mentioned that we want the forward direction, and we can do other things like override if we like. I'm just going to launch it in the forward direction. So the first thing we're going to need is get the rotation and get the forward vector from that. You imagine our character is rotating. We need to get that rotation and get the forward direction, and then launch and in that local forward direction, not world direction. Again, this could be different if you want, but I'm going to do mine in local forward direction. Let's say get actor rotation, pretty common node that we can use. Because our character is a type of actor, we can do that. From our actor rotation, we'll get the forward vector. So this is the direction using our rotation. So like the line that we want to push the character in or launch the character in. And then we could just plug this into the launch velocity. But here's the thing. We want to define how strong of a launch we want to do. If we just plug it in, it's probably going to do like, a very small velocity. So what I'm going to do is at this point, I'm realizing that I need a dash strength. And so we're going to make a variable for that as well. You imagine that we have the line of the direction that we want to dash in, but we maybe want to make that a longer line in order to make it a stronger dash, right? We want to push harder in that direction, not just push a little bit in that direction. So typically, if you want a increased force in a direction, you want to multiply that direction by an amount. And in this case, we're going to multiply it by a dash strength to get a stronger movement in that direction. Anyways, I think I've explained that enough. So let's create that variable. Let's come down here into dashing. We'll hit plus. We'll call this dash strength. Okay. We're going to come over here on the right under details, and the name's good. I think float is good because we maybe want some decimal values as we go when we're adjusting category. Let's also put that into dashing. I do think we want designers to be able to edit it, so we'll click that. I think that's good. Let's give it a default. So we'll compile, save. You have to use pretty big numbers anytime you're using forces and things. So I'm going to put 1300 here. This is just preemptively what I've found to be a good starting point, and then you can adjust this as you want. So we'll compile, save, and this is our dash strength variable that we can use. Now, the question is, how do we take our direction that we're getting from here and increase the velocity? And to do that, typically we would multiply a value. So I'm going to drag in dash strength, get dash strength. We can multiply a value by a direction and get a much longer line. And that's what we want to do, right? Currently it's like this. We want to push like that. So if I drag off of dash strength and I type in multiply, we'll just do multiply, and this should convert it for us. We're going to multiply a float by a vector. Plug that in. Okay, and we're going to disconnect our node up here by holding Alt and clicking. So we want to multiply our line vector, so our direction, by an amount to get a strength in a direction, and we're going to take the result of that and launch the velocity. And honestly, I think that should do a lot of what we want. So now that we've explained that, let's compile, save, and we'll just plug that in. I know I'm going to need other things here like sound effects and things. So we'll plug that in and just test it out. So we'll compile, save. So we'll launch the character using all these things over here, and then we'll wait and then do whatever else we need. So one more time, compile, save, come back in, hit the play button, shift. Okay, cool. Now there's a lot of things going on there. For example, notice that we don't have any slowdown at the end. We're kind of like gradually slowing down. A lot of times in games when we have a dash, we want to instantly freeze the velocity at the end, or we want to dampen it at the end. We'll do that soon, but for now we get our launch in a direction, and that's kind of what we want, like a really quick launch in a direction. So now that that's working, we can continue to build off of that. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp the velocity at the end of that dash so that it doesn't feel like we're moving really fast at the end. So I want to move really fast and then slow it down. Now I may not want to slow it entirely down, and we'll talk about how we can do that in a second. But if we go back into our character, I'm going to make a new variable. We'll call it end dash dampener. So at the very end, we're going to multiply this variable by our velocity and get the amount. Think about it this way. If we have our dash velocity and it's 100, we can multiply 100 by 1 and it's the same velocity. We could multiply 100 by 0 and it's 0 velocity. We could multiply 100 by 0.5 and it's 50 velocity. So our dash dampener is a 0 to 1 that will allow us to determine how much velocity do we want to maintain at the end of the dash. So I'm going to have that between 0 and 1, and I'll show you something cool over here. Let's hit the variable, and we'll call this end dash dampener. We'll keep that as a float over here. We will make that instance editable. Category, we'll say dashing, Now, here's the interesting thing, because I don't want this to go below 0 or above 1, we can just give it a slider range, say 0 to 1. And we can also clamp the value range if any other things are trying to change it. So 0, 1, and our intent is we're going to multiply the value between 0 to 1 to say 1 is full, 0 is empty. And honestly, another thing you can do is you can add a description here to make it more clear. So we can say 0 is no velocity, 1 retains current velocity. So we really want some kind of value between 0 and 1. Category dashing, we put that there, and we instance editable. Okay, all that's good. Let's compile and save. And I think what I want to do is put this right in the middle. We'll put it in the middle. If we need to adjust it, we can. We'll say 0.5 as a default. Compile, save. All right, so now we get a little slider, right? We can drag it up and down. Mine's kind of freezing a little bit, but I'm gonna put it back at 0.5. Compile, save. I'm trying to show you a couple other interesting options with our variables as we go. All right, so now we actually have to implement this. So right now we launch our character, we wait, and then at the end, when we're ending our dash, then we want to do some other things. We want to set this variable, say dash is ready, and then we want to do some other things. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set the velocity on the character movement component. So if I drag in my character movement component over here, I'll drag that in. Because this is a character blueprint, we can drag off of this and get access to the velocity on this character. And this component will just keep track of the velocity as the character moves around. And so we can really easily get access to it and set it if we need. So we're going to get access to it first, and then we're going to set it. So we need to get the current velocity at the end of the dash, and then we're going to multiply it by the dampener amount. So I'm going to pull in my in-dash dampener as well. Say get, remember this is 0 to 1. So we're going to multiply our current velocity from our character movement by our 0 to 1 value, and it will return a velocity between, its current and 0. So we'll pull off either one, doesn't matter. Let's pull off a velocity and type in multiply. Okay, multiply. And then if you get the wrong one, it'll convert it for us. So drag in. So we're going to multiply our end dash dampener 0 to 1 by our velocity, get the result of that, and we want to set it. So we also need a set from our character movement velocity. So I'm going to pull off the character movement again and type, and it is actually important that you pull off character movement, otherwise you may not see this variable. So as you pull off of character movement, we'll type set velocity down at the bottom. So you can see that there's a lot of different types of things you can do. Set velocity. Pull that up so we can see it, maybe reorganize this a little bit, pull that out. All right, so this is what we want to do with that result. And actually, let's pull in the result as well. Let's kind of clean this up. I'm gonna pull that over here. Okay, we're gonna plug the result of our end dampener multiplied by our velocity and put that into our final velocity. Character movement is the target because this is where our velocity is. And then we are going to connect our execution nodes, and then after that, we're going to set the variable. Now, you're already starting to see that this is getting messy. We'll clean this up in a second, but I'm going to pull this down, pull this over, and kind of pull this out a little bit. All right, I think we're good. Handy tip, if you click a node, and then you shift-click another node, and you hit Q, it'll align them. Super useful to know. No other good place to talk about it, so I'll just mention it here. Let's move those in. I think we should be good. So we're dampening it by 0.5 in this case. Let's compile, save, and go back. Hit play. Try it out. You see how we're kind of slowing down at the end now? And it's taking our current velocity and really clamping it right at the moment that we stop our dash. And then it'll handle itself past that. So just kind of useful. Again, you can actually tweak this if you want. Mine's at 0.5. You could retain the super speed if you want. But here's the other problem I'm noticing that we're going to have to fix next, I think, is we can keep dashing, which is great, for speed running, but maybe not what we want for our game. It's a little wacky. So we're going to make sure that we have a cooldown at the end of our dash next. All right, so I think this part will be pretty straightforward. Now we're going to create a cooldown after our dash is over so that we cannot immediately re-trigger the dash, because right now we're ending the dash, and then we're saying, okay, it's ready. So we could basically spam the button. What I want to do is I want to end the dash and then wait a specified amount of time to keep it on cooldown and then reopen it. Now, depending on your game, you could also say don't allow multiple dashes in midair, like you trigger it on landing or whatever. I'm going to keep mine real simple. You can always expand it if you want, but I'm going to need a new variable to determine a cooldown amount. And I am only going to start the cooldown after the dash is over. So let's make that variable now. We're going to come over here and hit plus, we'll call this cooldown between dashes. All right, now let's set up our properties over here. Float, yes. Description, we don't need it. Instance editable. Okay, designer control, so yes. Category, we'll put that in dashing. I'm not going to put any clamps on it on this one. I just wanted to show you that you could on the other, and I think the other one was important. I think let's put a default value, compile, save. I think 0.5 will be a good one, like half a second will feel right. Again, you could expand this if you want. I'll save that. All right, so now we actually have to put the functionality in now that we have our variable. So once we do our dash, we don't want to set dashes ready. We want to wait the cooldown and then say, yes, you are allowed to dash again. So we're going to pull off of this. And once we clamp the velocity, our dash is over. We're going to pull off and say delay, right? A little node that just waits a certain amount of time. And we're going to drag off our cooldown between dashes variable, say get, and whatever the designer chose, we're going to plug that in right there. We're going to wait this amount and then turn the dash back on so that we can redash. Let's compile, save, test it out. All right. So now we're going to try to spam it. Right? So we can't spam it too much, and we can define how often we want to spam it by what that cooldown is. So you can, modify that yourself, but I think 0.5 feels pretty good to me. Like we could theoretically dash multiple times in midair, but again, I'm keeping this simple for tutorial purposes. So we have the basic structure of our dash. I think we're solidifying this a little bit more. What I'm going to do now is instead of my print strings right here, I'm going to break these out into functions just to clean this up and compartmentalize these into other places. Let's put some of our nodes into a separate methods. So for example, I think my launch character over here, this is not super clear what it's doing. I think I am going to keep this separate, like whether or not it is ready. So we can call this like test for dash or something if we want. But let's go ahead and delete this print string and connect our true into our execution node right there. I'm going to drag this over. When it comes to functions, we can't typically put delay nodes in there, I believe. So I'm going to keep my delays outside of that to make it really clear when things are happening. But things that are related to my dash, I'm going to isolate into a separate function. So just highlight these nodes right here, our launch character and the these little nodes next to it that determine the direction and strength. Select these nodes, drag things out if you need room, right click and choose collapse to function. And once you collapse that, let's give it a name. We'll call this start dash. So you can see how much cleaner that is. We'll test, we'll decide if it's ready or not. We can set it here. Again, whether or not you put that inside the dash depends, but I'm gonna keep it out just in case. Now we can pull this in a little bit. We're going to wait, dash duration. Then instead of this, I'm gonna delete this node up here. Once I have that deleted, I'm gonna pull off, connect my completed into my set. And I think this portion where we're dampening the dash, I'm going to select my set with all these nodes next to it. I'm going to right click and collapse to function again. And I'll call this stop dash. All right, so now anything that's related to my start dash, I'm going to put inside of the function. So later on, this will be feedback effects and sounds and things. Anything related to stop dash, maybe more feedback and effects if we want, can go inside that function. And I can keep my larger things that are happening between these separate. So I can reuse these later if I want. Maybe we stop dash when we hit the ground. You could do that if you want, because you can recall this method or this function. All right, so I'm going to collapse this in, like pull that closer. So now whenever I add more to my start dash or my stop dash, I can do that inside of the function instead of outside of it. And again, we could collapse this more, but I didn't want to break it down too much too soon. So this is how we can clean up our blueprint slightly, or if you want to continue to clean it up, you can. Just recognize that your code will look a little bit different than mine if you decide to do that. Okay, so we have our basic dash functionality. If you have not compile save yet, go ahead and do that. And we can test it in here if we want. We have our basic dash and an end. You can see how it's slightly diagonal sometimes, and that's fine. But I think one thing I want now is some kind of feedback system that lets me know that a dash is happening. So a really simple sound effect and a really simple system, like a VFX system, to show that we're dashing. And again, we're not going to spend too much time on that. We're just going to basically trigger it, and then a VFX person or a sound person can go in and customize that later. We just want the hookup there for them. So I'm going to escape out and do that. In terms of the dash sound, I actually have one pre-made, but again, you can go to something like Chiptone and make a little simple dash sound. I'm just going to show you what I made. Dash. Kind of simple. So I'm going to drag and drop this in, this wave file. Actually, let's go to the right folder here. We'll drag and drop it in. Dash. It'll import that, and I can, highlight that and then click create a queue. Dash Q, great. We will save all, save selected. I like to do that anytime I create a new asset. We'll go into our queue, and I do want to add some basic randomization. So we're going to drag in a modulator. We'll plug that in. You can actually leave the default, and that's fine too. We can test it out if we want. Right, some really simple variation, that's fine. And then we want to play this when we start our dash. Let's go back into our blueprint here. Okay, so now that we have this inside of a separate function, then anytime we start our dash, and here, we can play the sound effect. So we'll launch the character. Let's actually bring this up. We'll launch the character, and then we'll play the sound effect. So we'll drag off and say, play sound 2D. I think in this case, I do want it to be 2D since it's related to a player action, and it's not multiplayer. So we'll say sound, select asset, dash, Q. You could play the wave, but since I set mine up with a Q with variation, I want that one. Compile, save, and we'll test that out. Hit play. You see how it adds just a little bit more? It feels a little bit better. Make sure that whatever placeholder sound dash you have, it's somewhat close. It doesn't need to be perfect, but don't make it like an explode. Well, you could make an explosion if it's like a booster pack or something, but I'm going to escape out. Okay, so we have our sound effect. Let's do a very simple particle system. In this case, instead of a burst, I'm actually going to create a looping particle that we're going to enable while we're dashing and disable once we're done dashing. You could do a burst if you want, but I'm going to do a enable disable. So come to FX, we can right click, create a new Niagara system. We'll use the default. So say next on the top one. And in this case, we have some options. We could do some pretty cool stuff if we want. Again, we're placeholder in our case, and the VFX person can customize it, or you can look up more tutorials later to make this look nicer. We're going to say let's say a looping fountain spray. Select fountain and hit plus, hit finish. Label this FX underscore dash. We can save, okay. And we'll double click this, come in here. You can preview it. I don't think I want to shoot it upwards. We actually want it to shoot outwards, like in the negative. So instead of going up, maybe instead of a cone, we can actually just have it coming out of a single point. And since our character is moving, that will appear like it's moving anyway. So I think that's fine. So let's change this from, let's say instead of cone, we'll say from point. Okay, so if we preview it, yeah, so we'll just attach this to the character. Again, it's kind of placeholder. As they're moving, it'll appear like it's coming out of the character, so that's fine. You can always customize this later. Let's change the color. Let's see, color mode, we'll change that. I don't know, I like to go blue for character stuff, placeholder. Go blue. We could always customize the size, min and max. Sprite size min, yeah, it's fine. Let's see what it looks like inside the scene. So in order to do that, we're actually going to save it and then trigger it in the blueprint. Now that we have it set up on a basic level, and then we can customize it once we see what it looks like. So the first thing is we want to turn this particle on and off. With Niagara, there's a lot of other things you can do. You can adjust values through code to make it look fancier. I'm just going to turn it on and off for now as a placeholder. Let's go into our SS character. Now here's the interesting thing. If we want to turn that on and off, we need a reference to it inside of our components. So I'm going to have this travel with my capsule component, with my character as we move. And so to do that, I'm going to come to my capsule component over here, and I'm going to add a Niagara particle system. We'll call this dash effects. And then over here in which Niagara system we want, we'll select that drop down and go to our dash. All right, compile save. So then once we launch the character, play the sound, we're going to drag in our dash effects, and we'll drag off of that and say set active. We'll just turn it on and off. Again, we can change this later. I really just want it for visualization. We'll connect that in and we'll say new active true. So we want to turn it on. Let's make sure that it doesn't come on by default. So we'll click this and turn auto activate off, compile save. And we also want to make sure that we turn it back off when we stop the dash. So go double click on stop dash over here in functions. Let's pull that up a little bit. And then when we stop the dash, let's get a reference to our dash effects, pull off of that and say set active. And new active, we'll just leave that unchecked because we want it to turn false. In other words, off, unchecked. Plug that in. I think that'll do it. Let's compile save. We may need to adjust the particles slightly. Let's come over here, save our scene, hit play, hit shift. Yeah, honestly, I think that's fine. You could customize that more if you want. You could reduce the size, whatever. But it's enough to visualize the dash for now until we customize it later. All right, so the last thing I want to do, and this is kind of an optional extra thing because I think it might come up, is when we dash, in a lot of games, we may want to pass through some objects. And pretty commonly, we may want to pass through enemies or projectiles or whatever. And I wanted to show you how you can start to control that in Blueprint, and then you can expand it out to however you want your dash ability to work. We'll look at how to pass through pawns, but we don't really want to pass through, for example, level objects. We want to be able to dash through these like that. But if we have an enemy in our scene or something, we may want the ability to dash through it. So we'll talk through how to set that up, and then for your own project, you can expand on that as you need for yours. So I'm going to come back. And all it comes down to is understanding the little collisions tab inside of our blueprint. So if we come over to our viewport and we look at our capsule component that is connected to our character object, if you scroll down some, you're going to see physics and you're going to see collision over here. And if you look on collision presets, you're going to see pawn and all these other things. These presets define how this collision works with other collisions inside the level. And we could put these on layers and then decide what can block other things, what can overlap, and we can pull off of that to test if there's an overlap, or we can ignore it entirely. What I'm going to do through Blueprint code is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say pawn will no longer be blocked during the dash, so I'll put it to ignore. And then when the dash is done, I'm going to uncheck that and move it back into block. So by default, we will be blocking pawns, other pawns inside of our level. And then during the dash, we will ignore other pawns in our level. So let's actually set that up inside of Blueprints. We go over to our event panel, which I'm just going to close some of these out of the way. All right, event graph, great. Okay, so we've already isolated out our dashing and our stop dash. So all we really need to do is make those changes in the start dash function and revert the changes in the stop dash. So I'm going to double click on start dash over here in our functions list that we set up before. A lot of times I like to have my effects happen right after I do my functionality because I just want my functionality to happen, as soon as I can. So let's pull off of launch character. And we're going to look for a blueprint node called set collision response to channel up here. And you can see it's actually looking at a lot of different components. We could select the one we want, but actually I think a better way to do this, because I don't want you to just select one and it's doing the wrong one, drag in your capsule component, just drag and drop that in. So we know exactly which one we're setting the collision defaults on. So if we pull off of that and then we search set collision response, there we go. And I'm going to say set collision response to channel. There. Make sure you click the right one. It's not all channels, it's just to channel. And what I'm going to do is, because I have my target plugged in, this is, right, if I click here, this is my component that has the collision that I want to set. So I'm going to set these down here off the capsule component. Okay, so I want to choose a channel in that list, and then I want to change the response to either block, overlap, or ignore. So the channel that I want to affect is pawn. I want to know what happens when this character collides with other pawns, right? So on this channel pawn, I'm going to set the new response during our dash, right? We're performing our dash right now. Set the new response to ignore. So I want to ignore other pawns during my dash, right? Compile save. Oh, it's actually not connected up. So let's do that. Connect. And connect. Okay. And then we'll compile save. I'm going to do the opposite inside of our stop dash. Now you'll probably recognize that this is a little bit of a hacky way to do it just because, for example, we don't know what our default channel is, right? Like we don't know that our pawn is being blocked by default. So we could do some things inside of begin play to set all the defaults and save them and then refer to those here. I'm just trying to keep it real simple and show you the basic way to do this. And then if you want to build a larger system, you can. So let's open up stop dash and we're going to do the exact opposite. Again, we're going to do our functionality. We'll pull our effects over there. We're going to pull in a reference from our capsule component to make sure we're setting this on the correct component. Pull off and say set collision to channel. There we go. By the way, if you did want to save the default, you could actually do that get collision by channel node over there and put that in begin play and store the result as variable. But I'm not going to do that and keep it real simple. Plug this in, plug that in. Okay, this is my capsule component. And the channel that I want to look at, again, is pawn. And my new response when we end the dash is to set it back to block. Now, again, if you want to save the default, you could save that as a variable and plug it into here and just pull from whatever it was set to initially. I'm not going to worry about it, but that's how you could do that. We'll compile, we'll save. The other thing about this is you would, if you do it this way, you would want to make sure that you are always stopping the dash, because if the dash gets interrupted, then you're not, not necessarily changing the response channel back, and that could be bad. So use cautiously, but that's what could happen potentially. Kind of trying to predetermine bugs here with our simple little system. So we have our start dash will ignore pawns, and our stop dash, we will block pawns yet again. So let's save this. Come back in, and we want to test this in our scene, but right now I have my BP_SS character. Maybe we can take our old, it actually doesn't matter. Let's try and put my character in the scene and let's see what happens. Put this in the scene. I'm going to put the position. I'm in world settings over here. We'll go to details. We'll make sure the position is 0. This is for my side scroller game type. For you, you can just put it, anywhere. And we're going to put it right before the ramp. Okay, so I'm just putting a character inside my scene. It is important that it's either a pawn or a character with some kind of collision on it so that we can test this. So we'll hit play. Okay, it does let me do that. Cool. So we'll come out. We cannot intersect with it, but if we dash, see how we can dash through it? Which is pretty cool. That's what we want, right? And if we end right on it, it might be a little funky. Right, we can try to time this. It'll either let us through or it won't. If we're far enough, it will. So it's kind of cool that it automatically handles that. Anyways, that's how you can do some basic affecting physics during your dash in terms of colliders and things if you want. Again, you could really expand out this idea. You could damage things through dash. You could do other complicated things with that. So I want to show you the basics of how you could start to manipulate this. But I think for now, this is pretty much all I want for my dash ability. We have the basics, we have the FX, it's moving, it's, has a cool little feature there, cooldown, lockout, and all that other good stuff. So I think this is a good stopping point. Hopefully this helped you out. This is kind of a cool little ability you could add, not just in side-scrolling games, but in other game types too, since it's just dashing forward. So hopefully you get a little bit out of this. Again, you could improve the VFX. You could do little mesh trails or whatever they're called, where you can, pose the character and have them semi-transparent and emissive. You can do some really cool things with Niagara here too, but this is the very basics of our dash ability. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.